Sometimes and particularly this morning when I was getting everything prepared, some of the things that I determined that I wanted to say needed to be said. It just kind of struck me that as we go farther into this journey together as a congregation, I kind of feel like I keep saying the same things over and over and over in one way or the other. If you boil it all down, some of the same things over and over again. And there was a long time, about 20 years actually, I spent on the road going around to this group, that group, that group, that group. And it was, what I had to say was fresh for them, and it was fresh for the next group, and it was fresh for the next group. And I could kind of do that, did it for a long time. But in this capacity, again, I find myself saying some of the same things over and over and over. And, sometimes people want to wow. Sometimes people want to, ooh, I didn't know that kind of a thing, including myself. But last night, Halissa reminded us that God does not change. His purpose and his plan is not deterred by our whims or our mistakes. He stays focused on his purpose. When it comes to the wows and wow, I didn't know that, and that's neat, and boy, I'd like to have another one of those. Before you know it, we get addicted to wows. I get it. I understand it. But sometimes those wows kind of take us down the wrong trail. Halissa said something last night that I have in some way or the other said myself, at least in private conversation. I spent many years speaking at prophecy conferences. And, I was on the platform with most of all those prophecy teachers. I'm not going to name names, but if you think of somebody who teaches prophecy, I've probably been in a conference with them. This little guy from South Georgia wondering what in the world he's doing here. But all those people that would come to those prophecy conferences, I noticed after several years, it was all the same people. And they were just coming to get another wow, coming to figure out who the Antichrist is. And then he gets killed, and then they have to start over, because that's what happens a lot of, when you're just studying prophecy in the terms of end times in the book of Revelation and Daniel. We speculate a lot, and then we find out we're wrong. So I come to conclude several years ago that when it comes to that kind of thing, it's going to happen as it is written, not necessarily as it has been interpreted. Okay? It's fun to do those things. It's fun to speculate. I enjoyed it. When I was a kid, I remember Sunday evenings after church, sitting in the living room, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, and sitting with the men who were drinking coffee and eating Krispy Kreme donuts and trying to figure out who the Antichrist was going to be. In those days, it was Henry Kissinger. By the way, he died the other day. Don't think it's going to happen. It was fun. I enjoyed it, and I cut my teeth on that. I get it. It's fun to study Hebrew. It's fun to study the Hebrew language and wow, I didn't know that. And all the different nuances of different Hebrew words and all the things that are embedded in those Hebrew words. And I get it, and I enjoy it, and I love to do it, and I encourage people to do it. Unfortunately, sometimes we get so addicted to the wow part of it that people take that and they run with it. And then before you know it, they've started a ministry and they put something on the website and they've started a whole new movement. And then before you know it, we have all these new revelations coming along. Pick your topic. If you've been in this any length of time, pick your topic. Calendars, pronunciations, shapes of the earth, all kinds of things. And my problem with it is this. Before you know it, God's purpose, which is, by the way, to gather and to unite his people, is subverted by the scattering that occurs when we're trying to push our agenda. And so my point is this. We were reminded last night, among other things, that it's very important for us to remember that the Father has not changed his plan or purpose. He stays true to his purpose. He stays focused on it. And so it is important that you and I do the same thing as well. And so if he's gathering and uniting, we shouldn't be scattering, should we? Right? He has not deviated from his plan from the beginning. We should not either. And so the whims and the wows have the potential anyway to get our eyes off of what his eye is on. And we need to be dedicated to what he has his eye on, to understand that purpose, to appreciate that purpose, and also to embrace the fact that to fulfill his purpose is going to cost. There's a cost. I was also reminded last night that the very fact that there is a people called Israel is a miracle. It's a miracle. I mean, the first patriarch was past the age of childbearing, and yet she conceived and she gave birth to a son. Rebekah was barren for 20 years of their marriage. She only gave birth to 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. But God intervened and she conceived and she had children. And those 2, by the way, were in conflict from the womb and remain in conflict to this very day. One of them dedicated to destroying the other. And so you think about that, conflict, division, strife, scattering, all of those kinds of things, animosity, jealousy. It's always been a big part of Israel's story. And so the fact that there is a people called Israel is a miracle. Were it not for the God of Israel, there wouldn't be an Israel. And so with those thoughts in mind, something that was spoken last night really just, it continues to resonate with me this morning. And that is as Balaam looks out upon the people, prophesies in the book of Numbers that the God of Israel sees no iniquity in the tents of Jacob. And I've always not been puzzled by that, but always been intrigued by the fact that as the seer is looking out and he sees the tents of Jacob and says that God sees no iniquity in them, that to me was quite amazing, considering things like the golden calf, Korah's rebellion, the grumbling and complaining, and all the different things that happen. So it's always amazed me that that was spoken. But something that Hulissa pointed out last night, as I said, it just continues to resonate with me because it's something I never really thought long and hard about, and that is this. That he was not seeing them as they were. He was seeing them as they were to be, which is to say he was seeing them as the Creator sees them, not so much as we would see ourselves. He wasn't describing them as they were presently, but as they would be. So he did not assess them as they were at this stage. And bringing our Torah portion into it now. Joseph's ordeal played a big role in the scenario or the scene that was laid before Balaam to pronounce this prophecy. It played a very big role in it. So all of these things, if I could summarize them before I actually get to my message. In Messiah, we've been redeemed. We are being redeemed, and we will be redeemed. We have been saved. We are being saved, and we will be saved. And so it is important that we strive to see ourselves as the Father sees us, and not necessarily as we tend to see ourselves. But that doesn't mean to think too highly of ourselves. That's not what I mean by that. But to see what he has ordained, what he has purposed for us, the goals, the expectations that he has for us, and then to strive to live our lives in accordance with that. So then, if I want to summarize my thoughts, the Almighty always has his eye on the future. It's never just about today. It's always with an eye on the future. And his plan is not stymied by current circumstances. He's always working to bring about his purpose, to bring it to pass in us and through us. And the amazing thing about that to me is that in order to bring about his perfect will and his perfect purpose, he has chosen imperfect people, just like you and me. But through hardship and through suffering, things like we see in the story of Joseph, he proves those people and uses them. So in our Torah portion today, after a very brief summary of Esau's family, the Torah now turns to the history of Jacob's family. So in Genesis chapter 37, beginning in verse 1, the Torah portion is called Vayeshev. Now Jacob dwelt. He dwelt. That's Vayeshev. And Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. And this is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all of his children, because he was the son of his old age. And also he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So as the parsha begins, Jacob is hobbling in, limping into the land of Canaan. Remember that little encounter he had just previously. So he's limping into the land of Canaan, apparently looking to settle down in the land of his father's sojourning. Because the word Vayeshev or Yashev, the root means to settle down, to sit down, really is related to that idea. And so the inference is that he's looking to settle down and hopefully live peaceably. He's been a sojourner. And maybe he's thinking it's time maybe the Father has brought me back into the land so that I can dwell in peace, and rather than all of this wandering. So maybe Jacob's got ideas of settling down permanently in Canaan, and who could blame him for that? Because at this point in time, he has just endured 20 years living in the land of Padan Aram with Lavan and dealing with all the abuse and the false accusation and being cheated and all those kinds of things, 20 years of it. But in those 20 years, he still managed to father the tribes. And so now coming back into the land, he endured all of that. He had to go through the encounter with Esau, and he survived that. He's fulfilled his vow at Bethel. And so he's thinking maybe, it would seem, settling down. But settling down was not in God's plan for him. He had not yet fulfilled his purpose. It was not yet complete. In fact, it had already been determined that Jacob, this guy who's had to endure so much, had to endure some more. It was already determined that he would not live his last days in the land of Canaan. And here's my point here. God's eye is always on the future. God's eye is always on his purpose and on his plan and his intentions for his people Israel. And so then, for you and I, it was saying that none of us really should think about settling down and getting still. And I will be the first one to admit that I have long thought about it would be great just to be able to sit still. But my wife keeps reminding me that she's never found the word retirement in the Bible. In the Bible, when you retire, you're dead. So it would seem that God's people are not purposed to sit quietly and to remain idle. Instead, as long as we live, as long as we breathe, we are to be about our Father's business. And part of that business is to be a light to those who are in darkness. Even in the kingdom, we're going to be about our Father's business. We're not going to be sitting around, being fed grapes, playing harps, and that's not the way it's going to. We're going to be busy. We're going to be doing things. But in this world, we're to be a light. And sometimes that means that it's required that the light goes to where the darkness is. And so I want to recommend to you that this Torah portion that begins saying that this is about the history of Jacob, I'm going to suggest to you that this that I'm talking about, this being active, doing, the purpose that we are fulfilled, is an unspoken and yet very obvious component of Jacob's history and this purpose. And on that note, it's interesting to me, the portion presents the history of Jacob, but it pretty much talks about who? Joseph. It focuses on Joseph, not really Jacob. Yeah, he's mentioned, but it really focuses on Joseph. Again, God's always got his eye on the future. God doesn't deviate from his plan and his purpose. And his purpose included in this particular case that Joseph was destined to carry the purpose of Israel forward. In my view, Jacob's history is personified in Joseph, somewhat anyhow, in the life of Joseph. Because the life of Joseph is a precursor to things that we see in the Messiah. And the Messiah is the head. He is the king of Israel. And so my conclusion or belief that the history of Jacob is personified, at least to a degree, in the life of Joseph. Joseph is the one who had to go down into Egypt first so that all Israel might be saved, but Jacob had to follow him. And it is certainly through Joseph, in that regard, that Jacob's history was preserved. So, as we get into the story of Joseph, that now brings me back to something I mentioned earlier. Jealousy, conflict, strife, animosity, things like this that have always been part of Israel's story, which again reminds us that there is a people called Israel is a miracle of God. And this conflict and this strife and this animosity and the jealousy and all the this, that, and the other, and the wives of the maidservants as opposed to Leah and Rachel's children, all the different things that were going on. I mean, can you imagine? Jacob is out in the field, and he's looking over the sheep and watching over them in this very pastoral setting, and he's enjoying looking at the scenery and the mountains and the hills and the green grass and hearing the, and all those kinds of things. No, I'm not. One time, that's it. And then he's got to come home for supper. And he's got 4 wives. Anyway. So all of this is a part of Israel's story, and it's amazing to me when you consider what the psalmist says and what we sing every time we get together. Behold, how good and lovely it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. That is the goal. And so it just really hit me last night, and some of what Hulissa was sharing with us is that's not necessarily stating that that's the way it is, but that is the way it's supposed to be. And I have to look no farther than this congregation, with all due respect, ladies and gentlemen, to know that we sing that every week, and we want to believe that, we want to be that, and yet we're still striving to get there. All right? Thankfully, the Father does not see us the way we are today. He sees us the way He's purposed that we are going to be, ultimately. Amen? Thank you all 5 that clapped for that. But if He chooses to see us that way, then we need to start seeing ourselves that way as well and live accordingly. Live up to that standard and that expectation. All right. So this strife and division and jealousy and betrayal, all part of the story of Jacob and his people. And yet it becomes very obvious to us that the exile of Joseph into Egypt, it had to happen. It had to be. But did it have to be at the hand of his brothers? Well, obviously that's the way God purposed it. And I don't, to this day, necessarily still understand all of that. But it fulfilled God's purpose. We know that Joseph was given a favored status. He was beloved of his father. We just read that. And we read how that he was with some of his brothers feeding the sheep. The actual Hebrew word is roy, and it's a word that can be translated as shepherding. So it implies that Jacob was there overseeing his older brothers, most of them, kind of telling them what to do. And we always like when a younger sibling tells us what to do, don't we? We always like these kids who are fresh out of college telling us how things should be done, don't we? All right. So that's kind of, in some ways, that's what's going on. In fact, there's an alternate translation of this particular verse I wanted to read. It's kind of interesting to me anyway. Joseph, being 17 years old, 17. We thought we knew everything at 17, right? And then we turned 21 and realized, I think it was Mark Twain who said it, by the time I turned 21, I was amazed to discover how wise my father had become in just a few short years. But being 17 years old, used to supervise, although only a lad, his brethren, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, when they were with the sheep. The point is, he was a young man, and yet his father had entrusted a lot to him. Perhaps it's because his father saw in him those skills, those talents, those components that he knew one day would come to fruition, even though at 17, probably had not. He's probably still somewhat immature, probably lacks discretion. I personally believe he was real short on that end of things, because it says he brought a bad report, an evil report. implying that the report he brought to his father about his brothers kind of lessened Jacob's view of them. Probably not a good thing to do, really, in this kind of a setting. So perhaps, and I say perhaps, youthful immaturity, and yes, young people, there is such a thing as youthful immaturity. You haven't learned everything yet, because I haven't learned everything yet. Jerry, have you learned everything yet? Are we still learning? All right, so just get over yourselves, all right? There is such a thing as youthful immaturity, and perhaps some indiscretion that if he did that, that would not have helped them to like him. So, add to this the fact that Jacob loved Joseph more, and he showed it. Probably not the best thing to do, maybe. It's, you love your kids all the same, and yet there's some that you connect with better. I get that. But all of these things is provoking jealousy and hatred. They can't talk peaceably. But I want you also to consider this. The ones that God favors are always the ones who are going to protect the covenant, to see the value in those things that are sacred, more so than others. Jacob compared to Esau. And maybe Jacob sees these things in his son Joseph, and perhaps that is part, anyway, of why he gives him this tunic, this coat of many colors. In those cultures, it is my understanding that a coat such as this that was multicolored was a sign, an indication of rulership, someone who was given authority. For example, in 2 Samuel, you can read about how the king's daughters were given robes of different colors to signify their status. But my point is, this garment signified that Joseph was to rule over his brothers. And we would think that would begin as soon as Jacob dies. He's given the status of firstborn because Reuben defiled his father's bed. So then the coat, the evil reports, he's going to have some dreams. All these things are kind of making for the perfect storm. They're fueling the brothers' contempt for him. And it says they could not speak peaceably to him. They hated him. And if things couldn't get worse, verse 5, now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. And so he said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright. And indeed, your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to me. And his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? And so they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, the 11 stars bowed down to me. Can you not appreciate what God is sharing with me? Look at what God is telling me. So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you've dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? And his brothers envied him. But his father kept the matter in mind. And I would recommend to you that perhaps it's because there are things that he's already seen, he's already perceived that are present in Joseph. Hence the coat of many colors. Now, I'm going to go on a little sidebar if you don't mind. It occurs to me that hearing from God is one thing, but having the wisdom to know when to share what God is telling you and who you're going to share it with, that's another thing entirely. Because how many of you, when you come into this walk, you just thought that everybody needed to know? When you've discovered that, we should keep the feast, we should observe the Sabbath, we should do this, we shouldn't do that, you just thought everybody else would just be as glad as you are to receive this revelation, didn't you? And what did you find out? Just because God's sharing with you doesn't mean it's time for you to share with him or that person right there. Having the wisdom to know who to share it with, when to share it is very important. And so then it could be argued that this potential lack of discretion on Joseph's part contributed to his exile. It could also be argued that in doing this, he incited their anger, which was supposed to happen, maybe. And of course, that played a role in the dream's fulfillment. So there are times then on this little sidebar that we're on, there are times to share. There are times to speak. But there are also times to be silent. In fact, Yeshua, on multiple occasions, held his peace. He didn't say certain things at certain times or in front of certain people. In fact, he held his peace when people were demanding that he speak, and he still didn't. This is what he said on the eve of his crucifixion, John chapter 14. I will no longer talk much with you. Why? For the ruler of this world is coming, and he has nothing in me. Long time ago, I gleaned from that statement that when the adversary is on a rampage and he's been working to get at you, when he's near in that regard, it's sometimes wise to keep your mouth shut and let God give you what you need and not divulge everything the Father's saying and give away the plan. Because our God is a good general, and he never deviates from his plan. I'm so glad that she shared that last night. He never deviates from his plan. He stays true to his plan. But he doesn't always tell everybody every aspect of his plan, because he's a good general, and he keeps certain intelligence under wraps until it's time for it to be revealed. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son. But guess what? He concealed a lot of those things about the Messiah until it was time for those things to be revealed. Paul said this, had the rulers of this world known, they would have not crucified the Lord of glory. And if they'd been able to figure out and not crucify the Lord of glory, where does that leave you and me? God is a good general. He stays true to his plan, but he doesn't always reveal every aspect of his plan to you and to me. He doesn't always tell us everything he has in store for us. How many of you have discovered that? 3, 4, 5. Okay. All right. The rest of you, you'll find out. He doesn't always tell us everything he has in store for us. He doesn't always tell us every step. And I personally believe that if he were to reveal just everything that you and I were going to have to engage and endure and overcome, some of us might hit the pause button and say, let me think about this. But it's the fact that he doesn't do that and challenges us to trust him and to walk by faith plays a very significant part in our development, in becoming those people that he's called us to be. These imperfect people being perfected by this walk of faith, this sojourning to be what he's ordained that we are to be. Joseph was told of his destiny. The sheaves are going to bow to your sheaf. The sun, moon, 11 stars are going to bow to your star. He's told, here's what it's going to look like, but it doesn't look like that now because they're throwing you into a pit. They hate your guts, and they're going to sell you into slavery. That might have messed with his head a little bit. In other words, God didn't show him that part. God didn't show him the time that he would spend in Potiphar's house. He didn't show him the time that he would spend in prison. And by the way, his ordeal was years, not weeks, not months, years. Just the prison part of it. He had to be in prison at least long enough to be found to be of such value that he's placed over the prison, and then add 2 years to that. So that part of his ordeal was years. God apparently didn't show him that part of it. He just showed him the end result, which in my mind kind of dovetails in some of what we were being taught last night. So the same is true, I believe, with us. He doesn't give us all of the details. He doesn't lay the path from beginning to end out. He might let us see the goal, but a lot of the things between here and there are in the dark still, and we have to walk by faith. And because we have to do that, sometimes it's hard for us to see ourselves the way he does, because we see ourselves the way we are right now. Sometimes doubting, sometimes uncertain, a lot of times afraid, sometimes even thinking, I don't think I'm going to make it. It's very easy for us to see ourselves as we are right now. But eye has not seen, and ear has not heard, neither has it entered into the hearts of those what God has prepared for them who love him, and not in the next life, necessarily or exclusively, but in this life. And so we mustn't become discouraged when the path before us takes us in an unexpected direction. How many of you, when you were sitting in the pew of the Baptist church, saw yourself sitting here today, 30 years ago? No, most of us did not. Sometimes the Father takes us in an unexpected direction, but that doesn't mean it's the wrong direction. The story of Joseph teaches us that, and moreover teaches that when we feel like life has veered off in some direction we didn't want to go or didn't expect to go, that even then, maybe especially then, God is with us. The fact that Joseph was given these two dreams with the same theme, mind you, that was indication that the end result is certain. It's done. Even if the path to that conclusion was, shrouded in mystery. In fact, that's going to come into play in the next Torah portion, Pharaoh's dream, and how that factors into everything. All of this is to say that the story of Joseph is not just a pattern for the Messiah, it's a story that we are to glean principles from, and encouragement from, and challenges from. In the story of Joseph, it is clear, we've already alluded to this, that his brothers were not ready to hear what he had to say at that point in their lives, whether it was from God or not. You cannot convince someone of something they don't want to be convinced of. I've tried it, it doesn't work. How many of you have tried it and found it doesn't work? But what we can do, we can focus on his purpose for us and not be deterred or not deviate from his plan for us when we know that he said, this is the way I want you to walk in it. So we can't convince others when they're not ready to be convinced. In fact, I would suggest to you that zeal that is not tempered with wisdom can result in a lot of undesired consequences. Sometimes we think God's telling us this, and it's not God at all. It's our soul, our soulish desires and whims, and then we make it God's voice. Be careful of that. Back to Joseph. I said that because maybe in his earlier years, maybe there was a little indiscretion in the sense of not being as wise as he should have been about what God was sharing with him. Maybe that was what he was supposed to do. But point is, later on in life, guess what? Because he was faithful through the ordeal, he stayed true to God's standards. He gained wisdom. He grew in his ability to be discreet. And more importantly, he was full of the Spirit of God. In other words, he matured and he was better prepared for what God had already determined that he was going to do. And it's also during that time that he's maturing that God is changing circumstances out there that his brothers have no idea what's about to hit them. For that matter, Joseph wasn't completely certain of how this is all going to play out, I don't think. But the point is everybody, Joseph and his brothers, are learning from all of this experience. What Joseph learns is that, one of the things that he learns anyway, is that God's favor places us in precarious situations. All of these things that happened to Joseph happened because God's favor was upon him. So how many of you would like God's favor upon you today? Well, understand, God's favor upon you, just like it is with Israel as a people, that favor does what? It puts a target on your back where the nations are concerned. God's favor places us in those precarious situations. That being said, if we are such as Joseph and others, we can place our confidence in him that he's going to bring us through that. He's going to enable and equip us to overcome all of these different obstacles and situations. For Joseph, that favor meant that he was hated and betrayed by his brothers. He was sold into slavery. He was exiled from his homeland. He was living among strangers who would falsely accuse him and would abuse him. And so, in short, what he learned is that to whom much is given, much is required. Through Joseph, we also learned that just because it seems the promise isn't coming to pass at that very moment, because we are very patient people, are we not? We're post-microwave society now. It's gone way beyond microwaves. And we want everything right now. When we're holding that device in our hand and talking to somebody on the other side of the world through a text, and we do not get an immediate response to them on the other side of the world, we start fussing at that phone and that satellite in the heavens. How come you can't get this to me faster? When we're streaming things on TV, there's a satellite up there somewhere in space receiving a signal, and it's sending it down to our television, and that little wheel starts turning, it starts buffering. We're like, doggone it. We're very patient people. So we learn that just because the promise isn't coming to pass at that particular moment doesn't mean that God isn't with us. It means that God's teaching us and God's perfecting us. In fact, it might be that in those times he's never been closer than he is right then. And I love the word that was used last night, lurking. Never thought of God lurking before in my entire natural life. But the thought of that he's lurking, his presence is lurking, watching, observing. I'm going to remember that to the day I die. Because even our present state, the way we see ourselves, he's watching, he's observing. And what is he doing? He is spurring us to grow and to mature and to be perfected, to come into the fullness of his purpose for us, which then prompts this question. Why would God bestow such favor and this responsibility upon such a young man, 17, who at that time anyway, apparently had not come into his own? Because he always has his eye on the future. God is the one who put those virtues and those talents and those skills within Joseph. And Jacob was perceptive enough to see those things, to recognize them, and to appoint Joseph to this position in the family. Which is just to remind us once again that we see ourselves as we are right now. And it's very difficult for us to see ourselves in the way that God sees us in terms of what he has intended that we are to be. And that reminds me of this passage in 1 John chapter 3. Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called children of God. Therefore the world does not know us, because it did not know him. Beloved, now we are the children of God. Now we are children of God. And it has not yet been revealed what we shall be. But we know that when he is revealed, we shall be like him. For we shall see him as he is. And everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself just as he is pure. And so I read this in a different light this morning. We realize what we are now. We realize who we are now. John says we are children of God. But there's something about us that is yet to be revealed. But it won't be completely and totally revealed until we see him and when he is revealed. Right now, as I see it, we're the children of God, but I see myself anyway as an imperfect child of God that he is trying to perfect through trial, hardship, suffering, all of these different things. But that is not what we are destined to be. That is, we're not destined to be eternally imperfect in Messiah. But in Messiah, we are being perfected. And in Messiah, we will be perfected. And when we see him, we shall be like him, because we're going to see him as he is. Because right now, we're being conformed to the image of the Son of God. But there is a day we will be like him. Tamim, whole, complete, blameless, lacking nothing. Which, by the way, is exactly what the Almighty said and spoke to Abraham in Genesis 17. I am El Shaddai, walk before me and be tamim. And so it makes me wonder if, in light of some of the things that kind of grabbed my attention last night, it makes me wonder if that statement was given to Abraham not to say this is who you are right now, but this is what you are to be. And ultimately, that's what you will become, you'll walk into. But beyond that, taking it to his descendants, his people, the people of faith, those who are heirs according to the promise, this is what you and I have been called to be, tamim. And so we have to, like Abraham, go on the journey. We have to come out. We have to go down. We have to go up. We have to be willing to lay everything on the altar. We have to go through the process in order to be perfected by that process to become tamim as he has called us to be. And so again, we have to see ourselves as he sees us and as he expects us to be, and then live accordingly. And that's why he gives us these things to do. Do this, don't do that. This is what pleases me. This doesn't please me. And because we see that day approaching, the day of the Messiah, that is, we are to be continually purging ourselves of things that are impure, to purify ourselves, to walk according to his instructions in his word, by his Spirit, guided by his Spirit, empowered by his Spirit, not in our own power. Because whatever he is, we are supposed to be. If he's pure, we're supposed to be pure. He's holy, we're to strive to be a holy people. And in so doing, as we purify ourselves, it seems to me that that is how we best fulfill this what's the word I'm looking for here? Well, we're told that Messiah is the light of the world. And in Messiah, what are we? The light of the world. And so as we purify ourselves, as we have been exhorted to here by John, in so doing, we are better able to produce the light that we are to be in the darkness of this world. Because in the day of the Messiah, that perfection is going to be realized. It's going to be complete. In that day, we are going to be what he has ordained us to be. And we'll see it. And guess what? Everybody else is going to see it too. Everyone will see it. But to the glory of God, not to man. And so our ultimate perfection coincides with the return of the Messiah when he is revealed, which that's kind of interesting to me anyway. I want you to consider something. Though he has been glorified and is perfect, still he is not perceived this way in the eyes of the world. There's a lot of people who just don't believe in him, period. But even though he has been glorified, he sits at the right hand of power, he is perfect, still in the eyes of the world, he's not perceived that way by many. And to some degree, that misconception or misperception on their part is due to our imperfections as his representatives on the earth. Let me kind of underscore that thought. John chapter 17, verse 20 and 21. Yeshua is praying for the disciples, and he says, but I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they all may be one. There's that gathering, being a united people. This is the Lord's prayer, that his people would be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that for the reason, for the purpose, that the world may believe that you sent me. And so the way I read that is that the unity of the body plays a role, at least to some degree, plays a role in the world's perception of the Messiah, in that the Father sent him or did not. Because he said they need to be one. I pray that they will be one, that the world may believe. And so that kind of leads me to think that if we are disjointed, disconnected, and scattered about and walking in all different directions, and animosity, jealousy, fighting, this, that, and the other, maybe the world is not going to see him in the way that they should. That's how it leads me to think. And so if we are one, they will believe the Father sent the Son. But if we are not, where does that leave the world as far as his being revealed? This history of Jacob that we've been reading about foreshadows, in other words, what would transpire with the Messiah. Jacob was favored of his father. That didn't set well with his brethren. The Messiah was favored, and that didn't go over well with many of his brethren. In fact, he came to his own, and his own received him not. I didn't write that. John wrote that. Joseph's brothers despised him. They hated him, and they would not consider him to be their ruler. Likewise, that was the way it was, and to some degree still is with Yeshua. He gave us this parable in Luke 19 about this ruler who went to a far country and was going to come back and receive his kingdom, but it says that his citizens hated him, and they said, "We do not want this man to reign over us." And interestingly enough, there were some on the day that Yeshua was crucified who said, "We have no king but Caesar." And so this story of Joseph points us to the Messiah, but that too was in the Father's plan. That too was his purpose. All of these things were to happen because the rejection of Yeshua by his brethren, just as Joseph was rejected by his brethren, laid the groundwork for God's greater purpose. That's why it's written, the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Messiah himself quoted that song, or that verse from the Psalm, speaking of himself, because his rejection by the nation laid the groundwork for the good news to be taken out to all of the different nations, but not to be taken away from Israel, but laid the groundwork for all Israel to be saved. God's always got his eye on the future. And what seems to us to be a misdirection, a wrong turn, something we weren't expecting, the Father is laying the groundwork for what he is going to accomplish. And because he stays true to his purpose, he stays true to his plan. Joseph's ordeal played a role in God's greater purpose for Israel. He had to go down into Egypt. Why? Because there was a famine coming. Did he know that at the time? No. Did anybody know that? Somebody did. And so Joseph had to go down into Egypt in order that all Israel might be saved. And beyond that, his going down into Egypt, Jacob coming down into Egypt, and the family growing and multiplying there, that laid the groundwork for the exodus out of Egypt so that the promise that was given to Abraham could come to pass, so they could go to Sinai and receive directly from the Lord his Torah. So I want you to consider this. This is kind of the point today, or one of the points. Today's suffering plays a role in tomorrow's victory. I know that most of us in this room, probably all of us, and everybody who's at home watching on the live stream, all of us have experienced suffering. All of us has probably experienced rejection. Maybe not to the degree Messiah or Joseph did, but we've all experienced rejection. We've all experienced betrayal. And painful as that is, we have to consider that the rejection by man is protection from man. Beth puts it this way, man's rejection is God's protection. But it's also possible that the suffering of today is helping us to be perfected in accordance with God's will. Because it's the suffering, it's the flesh that suffers that highlights the need for us to grow spiritually. And that suffering, like we see with Joseph and ultimately with the Messiah, in our suffering, maybe God is not only perfecting us at that time to be what he's called us to be, but it might be that he's also laying the groundwork for something greater to happen, something that God has in store, not just for us, but something that God has in store for people we've never even met. In other words, not just for our personal benefit. Joseph suffered personally, but it wasn't just for his benefit. It was for the benefit of a nation. Yeshua suffered, yes, but he suffered for the benefit of all who would believe. And so I have to conclude that my suffering and your suffering is not just for my benefit, but it's for the benefit of others that I have not met yet, that you haven't met yet. Because God's always got his eye on the big picture. He's always got his eye on his purposes coming to pass. And so in Romans chapter 8, verse 16, Paul writes that the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with the Messiah, if indeed we suffer with him, that we may be glorified together. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. And when is it going to be revealed? When we see him as he is. But this last statement that Paul makes tells me that he's looking beyond the suffering of today to see the victory that comes when we are perfected in the Messiah. He's looking beyond the today. He's looking to the future. And why wouldn't we do that? Because the Father is not just looking at today. He's already got his eye on tomorrow. He's already in tomorrow. He always stays true to his purpose. Yeah, if we're going to fulfill God's purpose, we're going to have to be willing to suffer. But Paul also teaches us here that when we're faithful, Joseph's story teaches us that when we're faithful, even though we're suffering, the Lord is with us in that. He is with us to encourage us and to enable us to do that. And by the way, he doesn't ask us to do something that he's unwilling to do, because we already have the example before us of the one whom we're following, who suffered on behalf of us all. You know, on the day of his resurrection, those two men that are walking to Emmaus, and they encountered the stranger, and he's talking to them. Why are you looking so sad? And what are you talking about? And all these kinds of things. Well, you know, life has taken an unexpected turn. Some things have happened we didn't really expect to happen, even though he told him it was going to happen. The one that we thought was the Redeemer of Israel, he was delivered up, was crucified, he was buried. This morning, people went to his tomb, the body's missing. This is the third day, and we're just not sure what's going on. He said, why are you so slow to believe all the prophets have written? Ought not the Messiah to have suffered these things and then entered into his glory? And beginning at Moses and the prophets, he began to expound to them all those things that were written of himself. Point being, he doesn't ask us, he doesn't demand of me to do what he isn't willing to do himself. In fact, he's already done it. And so to those who would follow him, he says what? Take up your cross and follow me. Now, you and I have been commissioned to go out and make disciples, right? Not a trick question. This is where you can get involved, okay? All right. We've been commissioned to go out and make disciples. But I want you to think about how we do that, with what kind of an attitude we do that. And what do we have our eye on as we do that? And by that I mean, is it what his purpose is what we're focused on? What he has his eye on is what we have our eye on? And our methodology, is it faithful to what the Messiah prayed on the eve of his crucifixion? Father, I want them to be one. I pray that they will be one. Why? So that the world will believe you sent me. And so as we go to fulfill that great commission, it's really important in how we do it. And it's really important for us to understand why we're doing it. We are here to fulfill his purpose in us and through us, that his purpose can be accomplished. Right now, the world may not see him as he really is, and we may have a part in that. So the world, a lot of them don't see him the way he really is. But they will. Because one day he is coming with the clouds and every eye will see him. And guess what? All of his enemies are going to be destroyed by the brightness of his coming. Now let's not get giddy about the fact that some people might be destroyed. No, let's be happy, let's be joyous at the fact and truth that our King is going to return, and he is going to accomplish the Father's purpose in the earth. And he invited you and me to take part in his purpose and his plan and be part of that. And so the world may not see him as he is truly. They will. Likewise, it might be difficult for us to see ourselves as anything other than imperfect people, which we truly are. But we need to keep in mind that in Messiah, we are being perfected. And he has challenged us to be tamim. He's challenged us to be perfect. And I may not feel that way today. I don't feel that way today. It's not I might not. It's I don't. But we need to see ourselves as being challenged to be that, and then to live our lives accordingly. And as that day approaches, to purify ourselves even as he is pure. So just because we don't see ourselves as God sees us, that's not going to negate his plan. But we have to continue to endure. We have to continue to be faithful. We have to keep our eye on tomorrow. Well, let me say this as well. In keeping our eye on tomorrow, that is the future, we cannot negate or neglect the duties of today. It's not yet time to dwell in the land. I know we've been through a lot. Some of us have been through more than others. And some of us probably feel, well, I've had to put up with Lavan for 20 years. I had to confront Esau. I've poured into my children, into my grandchildren, and I'm getting to that age. I want to kind of sit down and relax under my own fig tree. It's not yet time to dwell in the land. It's not yet time to sit around and, just sit on a pew and wait till Jesus comes. No, we are here to occupy until he comes. We're here to be on the move, to advance the kingdom of heaven until he comes. We are here to be salt. We're here to be light until he comes. And so this season seems to be the appropriate time to be reminded of what our purpose is in this world, to be a light. We're to be a light because he is the light. And so then, are we willing to suffer? Are we willing to take that unexpected turn and trust that God knows exactly what he's doing and his plan has not changed? Are we willing to suffer and kind of like the oil that's over here in this lamp, be consumed in order that we can give light? The very existence of Israel is a miracle. But guess what? Am Yisrael Chai. The people of Israel live. And why? Because the God of Israel lives. And yes, go ahead. And the God of Israel has determined to bring his purposes to pass through imperfect people just like you and me. And so let's continue to press on today. Let's continue to endure. Even in the midst of the suffering, even in the midst of I'm not sure what's going to happen, let's continue to press on today with an eye on tomorrow. Let's strive to look beyond our circumstances today. And I know that there's a vast array of them represented here. But in the midst of that, let's continue to lay hold of God's purpose, knowing that he doesn't deviate from the plan, and we shouldn't deviate from his plan either. Let's continue to be faithful to our call. Let's continue to be the light that shines in this world. Amen? Things you already know. Things that I feel like I have to say or I'm compelled to say over and over and over and over and over. But I go back to that fact that he does not deviate from his plan. He stays on point, and we've got to stay on point too. And so let's not be distracted. Let's not get off in the weeds and forget who we are, what we're to be doing at this day and time. Amen?